Hey everybody, welcome back. We're so happy to be here, and I'm here in one of my favorite places. We are in the Atlanta History Center. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. I'm Gary Edelman. That's Chris White behind the camera. And we've got some really cool treats in store for you today. And to start this off, let's kick it off with my friend Gordon Jones. He's the military curator here at the Atlanta History Center.
All right, well, thanks for that, Gary. We're standing here in front of the Locomotive, Texas at the Atlanta History Center. We have 33 acres of grounds and gardens. We have a history museum, we have a research library, we have historic houses, and we have one of the largest Civil War collections in the country. So this is a must-see destination if you're down this way. Now, right behind me, one of our largest and coolest artifacts. You were already up in Kennesaw, and you saw the Locomotive General. You know the story of the Great Locomotive Chase. Well, this is the other half of that story. This is the Locomotive Texas. And this, by the way, I'm just going to say, this is the locomotive that actually won the race, okay? So here's the thing. Now, when you look at this locomotive, though, let's think about it beyond the Great Locomotive Chase, because this locomotive was in service from 1856 all the way through 1901, more or less. And during that time, of course, it's just a piece of machinery. And it's rolling up and down the Western and Atlantic Railroad from Atlanta to Chattanooga, hauling supplies, hauling freight, passengers, and doing the work that built Atlanta. And along the way, its parts are all replaced depending on what it needs. So it's got, new wheels, new boiler, new cab, virtually everything on this locomotive was replaced. If you want to see what was original to the Great Locomotive Chase, that's maybe only 5 to 10% of the whole thing. All right, so that's the frame, the structural frame, and probably the bell stand are the only two things that remain from the Great Locomotive Chase. So if you wanted to restore this to the period of 1862 to the Great Locomotive Chase, you'd pretty much have to build a new locomotive. And we're not even really sure what the thing looked like at that time, although we did find in our paint analysis when we had this restored some green and blue paint down on that frame. So we don't know what it looked like, but we're interpreting this locomotive right now in 1886 as it looked. It's an honest restoration of the sum of its parts. And we put it on the front of the building here at the Atlanta History Center because Atlanta is a railroad town. We were built on the railroad. We have no navigable rivers. It was a railroad that started the city. And Gary, let's look at one other thing that's closely related to that.
Yeah, and we won't even touch on all the incredible things you have here at the History Center. We're only going to show a slice, but I do hope we'll show you some of the coolest things. And this next thing is one of my favorites.
Oh yeah, this is definitely the cool thing right here. Now look, behind us here, this is what's known as the 0 mile post. And we said that Atlanta's a railroad town. All right, well, this was the post that marked the absolute center of Atlanta, the geographical center of Atlanta, from which all property boundaries were measured. And that was at the terminus of the Western and Atlantic Railroad. That's how they marked the city. And you can see on the post, all right, you can see in the stone, WNA RR 00, the actual ground zero. If you look over here on the other side, you can see 138, which is the mileage to Chattanooga. So this right here, for what it's worth, is kind of the foundation stone of Atlanta.
And one of the things I love about the History Center is, look, we're here, we're touching this actual stone. You can walk into the cab of the Texas. This is not a stay away facility, which I think is great, Gordon.
Exactly, and we want people to engage with these kind of artifacts. We want people to understand what that history feels like, because we have what nobody else has. We have the real thing. That's what really makes history fun, is that you feel the real thing. We've got the real thing. That's the advantage that museums have.
But they also do some tech. So why don't you show us one last thing before we wrap up?
We don't have the real thing in terms of the actual war in Georgia in 1864-65, but we do have this wonderful animated map that was developed for the Cyclorama exhibition, and it summarizes the war in Georgia from the Atlanta campaign in the spring of 1864 all the way through Wilson's raid and the capture of Jefferson Davis in the spring of 1865. And it shows this in about 12 minutes. Now, Gary and the other guys with the American Battlefield Trust and Charlie Crawford and a bunch of other fellows helped us with this, and we hope that it is as accurate a representation of the military movements of the campaign as we can make.
Well, super cool, Gordon. I think this is a great introduction, man. I can't wait to see what you have in store for us as we go around. We're going to check out the cyclorama. We're going to check out some of the incredible Civil War exhibit you have here called The Turning Point. And then I think we're going to head behind the scenes a little bit. So thanks so much, Gordon. Thanks to Chris behind the camera. Thanks to the Atlanta History Center. And thank you for supporting battlefield preservation and education. Hey, welcome back, everybody. We are at the Atlanta History Center. We are in the incredible Turning Point exhibit. There are more than 1,500 objects in this exhibit alone, so we can't focus on all of them. In fact, we're going to focus on just a handful with the military curator here at the AHC, Gordon Jones.
You know, one of my favorite artifacts is also a recent acquisition. We've been trying very hard here at the History Center to make sure that we tell an inclusive history, and that means we need to collect artifacts that were used by black troops and the United States colored troops. That story is vastly undertold, but we're trying to tell it. And the problem with collecting from the United States colored troops is that it's hard to tell what is a USCT artifact and what isn't, because they were issued with the same things as white soldiers. So unless somebody put their name in it, you don't know that you have anything. Well, here's an artifact that's an exception to that. So look at this knapsack right here. And you can see big and bold, the owner, Ezra Brooks, put his name in it, 8th Infantry U.S. Colored Troops. Beautiful. Ezra Brooks was from Ohio. He was listed as a quote-unquote laborer. Trained at Camp Penn in Pennsylvania. That's where the 8th trained. Very famous regiment. But also look at the knapsack. That is not a standard issue U.S. knapsack, Gary. You know what that is?
It looks like deer skin or something.
It's actually calf skin. And you will recall the story of the Pennsylvania and Massachusetts troops early in the war. They ordered 10,000 chasseur uniforms and accoutrements when there was nothing else available and they wanted to look extra sharp. They ordered them from France. The uniforms came over here and half of them were too small because the big American boys couldn't fit into those little tiny French uniforms. So they were all sent back to storage, including the knapsacks. Now, it so happens that one of the non-commissioned officers from one of those white regiments was an officer in the 8th USCT. And apparently he remembered these knapsacks, these calfskin knapsacks. And when it came time for the USCT to be issued with materials, he apparently requested that these knapsacks be brought out of storage, and they were given to the soldiers in the U.S. colored troops. Now, the other thing we know about this one that's fun is that this knapsack actually saw combat. The 8th United States colored troops went into its first battle in February of 1864, the Battle of Olustee, Florida. And they were rookies. So they didn't drop their knapsacks the way veterans did before going into battle. They still had them on. And we know that because there are references by other soldiers to the 8th, and they refer to them as the hairy-backed Negroes. only they don't use the word Negro. But the hairy back refers to these calfskin knapsacks. The USCT, 8th USCT, was badly shot up at Olustee. They did not get the order to fall back with the other troops, and they stood their ground and they fought, even though they were shot almost to a man. But they showed their courage and their bravery at that time. But they also learned a lesson in soldiering, which is use your common sense and fall back. And after that, the USCT, these guys were, the 8th USCT, these were veterans. They remained in service all the way through 1865. As a matter of fact, they were in the brigade of USCT that chased Lee to Appomattox in the waning days of April 1865.
Wow, that's really interesting. And if you haven't been to Olustee, it's definitely worth a visit. Now, before we move on to the next objects, and it's going to be a little bit of a walk, and Chris White behind the camera will show you some stuff. I just think it's a great testament to, Gordon, your acquisitions team and your curatorial team, that so much of your stuff is in such excellent condition, such as this piece right here.
We try.
Good, good. Just unbelievable. Just in those few steps we took since the last object, and Chris behind the camera showed you some of those, but we must have passed by 700 or 800 items since then. So again, you got to come here and see all this. But Gordon, what do we have here?
We're at the sort of the defining moment of Turning Point, the American Civil War, which is our signature exhibition on the Civil War. And this is where we talk about the events of 1864, the decisive year of the war, and of course the year of the Atlanta campaign. And you'll see behind me two flags. The one over here, you may recall, those of you who are old enough to have watched Gone with the Wind, you will remember the very famous scene in there where there's a Confederate flag on a flagpole, and it's near the train station, and there's a pan back, and you see the flag flying in the foreground, and you see all this field of Confederate wounded laying out on the ground by the railroad. That is a fictional scene, or is it? This flag right here, which is actually a second national flag, what was shown in the movie is just a battle flag, second national flag, and you'll notice that the white field extends all the way over here to the top right corner. And this flag was flying over Atlanta on September 2nd, 1864, when the city was captured. And there is a photograph, one of the Barnard images of downtown Atlanta near the passenger depot. And just to the side of that image, a lot of times it's cut out, is a mast-like flagpole that had to be for a very, very large flag. Maybe this one, all right? This is actually the storm flag. It's 20 by 10 foot. probably made in Charleston. The flagpole was designed probably to house a garrison flag, which was 18 by 36. But this flag was taken as a souvenir by the 4th Iowa Regiment, presented to their colonel. Their colonel later immigrated to Arizona. In Arizona, he had an attack of conscience, and he gave it to the local historical society. And then it ended up in 1975. The historical society says, "What are we doing with this Atlanta flag in Arizona? Did somebody make a spelling error?" So they said, "All right, well, who in Atlanta might we find who might want this flag?" And of course, they found Beverly DuBose, who was the most prominent collector at the time and in Atlanta. And coincidentally, not related, in an unrelated transaction, the Arizona Historical Society received a $500 donation from Beverly DuBose. That's how we ended up with that flag. The other one, pretty exciting, this is also from the DuBose collection, and this is believed to be the flag that was on Admiral David Farragut's flagship at the Battle of Mobile Bay. Now, this one was in the DuBose collection, and it was wadded up into this little roll with a little silk cover and had a little tag on it that says this was the flag that Admiral Farragut nailed to the mast at the Battle of Mobile Bay. And we're looking at that saying, yeah, right. So we unfolded it, and we began to realize that there might be something to this story, right? It's a naval flag. You can see the hoist, the rope hoist on the hoist end. You can see that the fly end has been patched. It is where it is tattered on the fly end. Pieces of the flag over toward the hoist side have been used to patch the fly end. It's got the right number of stars for August of 1864, and most importantly, there seems to be no other flag that we could locate that claims this provenance. So this really could be Farragut's flag, but if it is, he didn't nail it to the mast because there's no nail holes in it.
I'm reluctant to admit this, but I confess when I've been here before that I think I thought I was looking at a more standard Confederate flag over there on the left, but what in fact is a much larger flag. I just want to make sure everybody understands that is just a small piece. What's that part of the flag called that just has the
canton? That's the canton.
Yeah, so the canton is just that little piece, but that Confederate flag is actually overlapping the U.S. flag here.
Yeah, a lot of people miss that.
Yeah, I certainly did. So, Gordon, anything else to say, or are we good?
We're good. Y'all come to see our exhibit, come to see the Atlanta History Center. We would be glad to have you here, and you might learn something. It'll be fun.
Learn something and get, from what I could tell, a really good cup of soup and a really good cup of coffee, even decaf. So, Gordon, thanks so much for having us. Thanks to everybody for joining us today, and thank you all for supporting battlefield preservation and education. And Chris will show you a little bit more of the exhibit on the way out.
Gary, you really need decaf.
Hey everybody, all good things must come to an end, and this is likely going to be our last video of our Georgia video swing. Something we started planning months ago, something we couldn't do until you all, the members of the organization and our generous supporters here on YouTube, actually helped us to raise the fund to make this trip a reality. I hope you've watched all the way through all these videos we've shot, the dozens of videos, and we hope you've learned a little bit more about the American Civil War, about American history, and maybe a little bit about yourself and other people you know. Sorry to get a little heady there. So on this last video, Atlanta has already fallen. We've talked about all the battles, but you know, these armies aren't just gonna stay hanging around facing each other. In fact, John Bell Hood knows he can't do too much to Sherman. He's gonna strike out off toward Tennessee. we know that William Tecumseh Sherman will famously march toward the sea, not Tennessee. We're going to explore these in a little bit of detail here. So first, let's bring on Chris Mikowski, who's going to talk about John Bell Hood's movements.
The sea, Tennessee. I see what you did there, Gary. So when we left the Battle of Atlanta, Confederates lose. On the 22nd of July, the 23rd, Stephen Dill Lee will get promoted to Lieutenant General, the youngest Lieutenant General in the entire Confederacy. He's going to come and join this army. It's going to be one of several command changes that Hood's going to juggle with because he, of course, had A.P. Stewart taking over for Polk. He's got Benjamin Franklin Cheatham, who is then going to shift back to division for a while, but then William Hardee is going to get himself all upset about Hood's leadership, and he's going to leave. And then Cheatham will get promoted to take over Hardee's old corps. And so as Hood is trying to figure out how to run this army, how to hold off Sherman, what to do with his dwindling numbers of men and supplies, eventually, when the Battle of Jonesboro happens, he's going to lose Atlanta, and he's going to pull out, and he's going to start harassing Sherman's supply lines. And there's going to be an actual whole campaign in North Alabama, and Sherman's going to be chasing Hood around, and Hood's going to be moving, and finally Sherman says, enough of this, I can't handle this, I can't go after him, and he's going to come back to Atlanta and then head off on his famous march, which we'll talk about in just a minute. That leaves Hood with some pretty tough choices. He has no good options, and what he's going to do is strike up into Tennessee, as Terry mentioned, and try to harass Sherman's supply lines. We have talked this entire trip about how important the Western and Atlantic Railroad has been, how important that supply line has been, and Hood is going to target that. But as a result of that movement, High Command, Grant, the War Department, they're all nervous about what Hood might be doing, and so Sherman's going to be forced to give up some of his corps as he moves toward the sea. Some of his army is going to head into Tennessee. And to talk about that a little bit, I want to bring in our friend Charlie Crawford, who's going to talk about the options that Sherman faces at this key moment as Hood heads north into Tennessee.
Sherman chased Hood around North Georgia for the better part of a month. In fact, one of the most highest casualty rates for a battle was the Battle of Allatoona Pass on October the 5th, 1864, when Hood tried to break Sherman's supply lines. Sherman, as early as August, was badgering General Halleck, and through him General Grant, to let Sherman cut loose and either march to Pensacola or Mobile or Savannah. In other words, to show the heart of the Confederacy was hollow and that they couldn't win the war. He finally breaks off from Hood in early November, and when he's coming back toward Atlanta in the town of Kingston, Georgia, he receives a telegram from Grant saying, "Go ahead as you propose." In other words, it's the authorization for the march to the sea. Why wait until November the 2nd? Because there's no way Sherman can get everybody together and then depart from Atlanta for Savannah before Lincoln is safely reelected. The other reason that Sherman can do this, think about it, November. The harvest is in, so that's why he can march across Georgia and live off the land without a railroad supporting him. He couldn't have done that in May. He couldn't have done that in the spring.
As Sherman is thinking his options now, Hood thinking his, he's going to strike up into Tennessee, and he's going to head to a little place called Nashville. It's the first Confederate capital to have fallen, and it's been the eye on the prize that the Confederates have had ever since. And as he is lured northward into a series of engagements, he's going to have something at Spring Hill that almost turns into something. He's going to have something at Franklin that turns into something terrible, and he's finally going to get to Nashville, where his army will crash against the ramparts of the Rock of Chickamauga's defenses there that George Thomas has set up. In the meantime, things go much more differently for William T. Sherman. I'm going to ask Gary to come back in and set the table for that one.
And I'm barely going to set it up. And by the way, my name is apparently Terry Edelman, not Gary Edelman, as some of you might have caught. Thank you, Chris. So really, just to talk about, I only popped back on to introduce our friend again. This is Todd Gross. He's a longtime president of the Georgia Historical Society, which is in Savannah. And somehow he's going to bring Sherman toward that area and then tell some cool stories as well. So come on, Todd.
Well, thank you very much, Gary. So when Hood is going to Tennessee and Sherman turns back towards Atlanta, heading towards the sea, we have this anomaly really in history of two opposing armies marching in opposite directions from each other. On November the 16th, Sherman has made up his mind. It's time to begin the march. Sherman had watched as battles became bloodier and bloodier, and still nothing had been decided. Atlanta has fallen. The Confederates still haven't given up. So he now says, I'm going to change the nature of the war. I'm going to start waging war against property, and I'm going to make the Confederates feel the harsh hand of war. And so on November the 16th, after spending 5 days destroying the heart of the city of Atlanta, 60% of the city was still standing when he left. One of the great myths is that all of Atlanta was burned. On November the 16th, the United States Army, under the command of General Sherman, leaves on the infamous March to the Sea. It will take them about a month. They will arrive in Savannah in mid-December. Along the way, they will live off the land, and they will repeat the procedures, the tactics that they have used here in Atlanta. They will burn anything that can be used by the Confederates: factories, warehouses, railroads. They will eat all the food. They will take horses. Most of the private homes will still be standing after Sherman's march. It's one of the things that escaped all of that. They get to Savannah after, as I said, after a month, and they lay siege to the city. General Hardee, who's in command, evacuates the city. Sherman marches in. He claims the city and presents it to President Lincoln as a Christmas present just before Christmas of 1864. Now, as Gary said, the Georgia Historical Society was in existence at that time. In fact, we're the only institution in the state, a historical group, that was actually in existence during the Civil War itself. We were founded in 1839, and that's key to why we're headquartered in Savannah and not in Atlanta, because in 1839, there is no Atlanta. It was a couple of shacks at the end of a rail line. The capital was in Milledgeville in those days. We've been in continuous operation now for 183 years. What's interesting is to look at the minutes of the board of the Georgia Historical Society and read what they're saying about Sherman coming towards Savannah. It's almost as if a hurricane is coming towards them, a storm is coming. They're trying to figure out what to do with the vast archive of the society. And rather than leave it in the archive, they move it into a warehouse, which, if this had been Atlanta, would have been the worst thing that they could have done, because it would have guaranteed the destruction of all of those early treasures that the society has, including a drum that was carried in the Revolutionary War and an original copy, one of only 13 in existence, an original copy of the United States Constitution. Wow. After the war, we actually received a number of Civil War artifacts. We received those from the veterans themselves, not from some collector later on. We got those from them because we were in existence during that time. So Gary, whoever's going to take over now, I'll turn it back to Chris. Okay.
Now, we've got two armies, two very different fates, and you can walk in their footsteps. In some of the previous videos that we have done earlier in this year, you'll remember that the American Battlefield Trust went through Tennessee. We took you to Spring Hill. We took you to Franklin. We took you to Nashville. We want you to watch those videos so you can see what happened to Hood's army as he went up there. We went to North Carolina, where Sherman's army is eventually going to shift and move up through South Carolina, get in there, and we took you to Aversburg. We took you to Bentonville. We took you to Bennett Place, where the remains of both of these armies will finally meet again. And you can be there thanks to your own generosity and the work of the American Battlefield Trust.
Thanks so much, Chris. You covered a lot of what I wanted to cover at the end, so all I have to say is thank you. Thank you to everyone. And get ready. You may have to change your financial plans, because the Georgia Historical Society does great work. We hope you'll get to learn and get involved with them. We, of course, hope you'll get involved with the Georgia Battlefields Association. Maybe become a member of the Atlanta History Center. Get to know the Browns Mill Battlefield Association. How about the local folks associated with places like Dalton and Tunnel Hill and Rocky Face Ridge? Chickamauga needs help as well. And of course, we appreciate anything you do to support the American Battlefield Trust. Thank you to all of our guests, namely our main crew, Chris White, doing all sorts of work behind the camera and late at night in the room in downloading these files, Chris Makowski for being jack of all trades, and to you for being patient and for supporting this effort. Thank you so much for all your support of this trip and of battlefield preservation. Hey, welcome back, everybody. That's Lookout Mountain right behind me. We are on some of the property on which the American Battlefield Trust was able to preserve through a conservation easement not long ago. And our efforts actually continue here at Chattanooga, where we have preserved together more than 400 acres, either in fee or by easement. And we're going to talk about some of those properties, because this is the real deal battlefield land. Here we are below Lookout Mountain, and on November 24th, 1863, you're going to have Union troops under John White Geary coming across this very land here. As you know, during that battle, the Union troops are going to move around Lookout Mountain rather than going all the way to the crest. They didn't have to. and this is the land where they're going to be crossing, and there's the land where they're going to be fighting right over there. And we want to talk more about this, and we're going to do it first with Jim Ogden. He's the historian here at the Chickamauga Chattanooga National Military Park.
Thank you, Gary. And as Gary said, we are on part of the Lookout Mountain battlefield. This particular piece of property is the not-for-profit Botanical Reserve, Reflection Riding, Arboretum, and Nature Center. This not-for-profit, with whom now the trust has an easement, protects a 300-acre portion of the battlefield, which includes access, and they are open on a scheduled basis, so this is a place you can visit, but it includes access to the point at which Gary's troops crossed Lookout Creek, Lights Mill, something that it really isn't accessible from any other point except through reflection riding. Also, as Gary indicated, as Gary's men sweep from south to north, on the ground we stand right here. The left of Candy's brigade sweeps what was then and still is today a large agricultural field as they sweep towards the northern point of the mountain. And just a little bit to the north of us is where additional Union troops under William Gross and Charles Woods will cross Lookout Creek to join that sweep over the mountain. And adjacent to this is another 7-acre parcel that has been protected and some additional property as well. So the Lookout Mountain battlefield has gotten better protection in the last few years thanks to the work of you all, members of the American Battlefield Trust. The Trust has also worked on the Missionary Ridge battlefield in the area of the Confederate right flank near Tunnel Hill, the point where the East Tennessee and Georgia Railroad passed through Missionary Ridge in a 980-foot long tunnel. Several parcels totaling more than 70 acres have been protected, including part of Billy Goat Hill occupied by Sherman's men on November the 24th, and some acreage on the slopes of Tunnel Hill where Sherman's men attack Claiborne's troops on the top of Tunnel Hill on November the 25th. These properties, particularly as the access is provided to them, will allow for a better appreciation of the difficulty of the fighting there on Missionary Ridge. This is, again, work that you all have helped facilitate, and in the case of the Missionary Ridge property, the Trust for Public Land was also involved in those acquisition efforts as well.
Good. Before the battles of Missionary Ridge, Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge, of course, the Union Army, trapped in Chattanooga, had to open their supply line, what they referred to as the cracker line because of the hardtack crackers. A couple of the sites we've preserved about 2 miles from here at the base of Lookout Mountain are associated with that event. One would be the preservation of roughly 15 acres at Brown's Ferry. Brown's Ferry is where the Hazen's men from the Union Army of the Cumberland will land on the night of October in the middle of the morning of October 27th and make an amphibious landing to open the cracker line. Later, Hooker's troops will march in. They've come from Virginia. They march from Bridgeport. They will go in to camp around another site we have preserved, Brown's Tavern. It was built by Cherokee, associated with a nearby ferry. Hooker's men will go in to camp around the tavern, and from there it will essentially be Hooker's command post as he sends reinforcements to the Battle of Walhatchee, fought a day or so after the landing at Brown's Ferry. Now, not only are these sites important in the Civil War history that we all love so much, this is multi-layers of Tennessee history. Brown's Ferry was a very important site during the Trail of Tears during the Cherokee removal. 3 detachments, the Drain, the Bell, and the Whitley detachments, all used Brown's Ferry during the Trail of Tears. They will march past the tavern undoubtedly. Some of them stop there for water. So when we've saved this, not only is it important to tell the Civil War story of the Chattanooga campaign, you have helped save part of the Cherokee removal story as well. As I said, this is multi-layers of history we're dealing with here in Chattanooga.
Good, thanks. I'm going to hand you the camera, Dr. Hodges here. That was Dr. Anthony Hodges of the Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association. So thank you so much to you both. And I just want to say that, you know, this is what we can do at one place. Chattanooga is one place, and it is like a puzzle, piecing things together. And this is one of the going on 150 different battlefield places we've been able to preserve together in 25 different states. We're just about there right about now. So I can't thank you enough. I can't thank our local partners like the Tennessee Civil War Preservation Association, the Georgia Battlefields Association, of course the Battle of Franklin Trust, the Central Virginia Battlefields Trust, the National Park Partners, and so many others with whom we work to get all of this done. I can't thank you enough. We hope you enjoyed seeing a little bit of what we've been able to do together. Thank you so much for all of your support.